Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this CUGR talk. Today, we have a group of panelists who are here to talk about the research that undergraduate students are doing in their areas. So I'm going to begin by introducing each of the panelists, and then we have a few questions to begin with. So I'll ask a question, and then I'll have each of you respond. And then we also will have some time at the end from questions from the audience. So if you're here and you're trying to figure out, as a student, a good way to get involved in research, definitely write down your questions, and we should have plenty of space for that. So again, thank you all to all of the panelists. We have Dr. Stefano Tiharina. Dr. Stefano Tiharina teaches in the areas of international business, comparative business, and ethics. Prior to his academic career, he worked in the areas of international banking and nonprofit management. He received his BA in comparative politics from Clark University, a graduate certificate in international relations from Universidad de los Andes, and his MPA and PhD in history from the University of Maine. His current research centers on the business dynamics of the Western Hemisphere from a historical perspective. He's the author of Circumventing Empires, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1767 to 1968, published by University of Toronto Press, and has published articles in the Journal of Canadian Studies, American Review of Canadian Studies, Hiperstoria, Ensayos sobre Política Económica, Desafíos en Perspectivas Colombia Canadienses, as well as chapters in several edited volumes, including Mercados en Común, Estudios sobre Conexiones Transnacionales, Negocios y Dominica en los America, and Working for Oil, Comparative Social Histories of Labor and Petroleum. He's also a contributor to the New Economic Papers History blog and activehistory.ca. In 2017, he was awarded the first Christopher Cobrock Research Fellowship from the Canadian Business History Association. And Dr. Tiharina, I apologize if I did not pronounce those journals correctly. My Spanish is very limited, so hopefully you were all able to understand. We also have Dr. Laura Ardasani with us here today. Dr. Laura Ardasani is chair of the Division of Music in the School of Performing Arts at the University of Maine. In addition to her administrative duties, she teaches music education courses, serves as piano accompanist for the university singers, and frequently performs in faculty and student recitals. Dr. Ardasani graduated summa cum laude from Barrington College in Rhode Island with a BM in music education and received an MM in piano performance from the University of Maine. She earned a DMA in piano performance from West Virginia University, where she was the recipient of the Swigert Teaching Fellowship for 4 years. She's completed level 1 through 3 of Orf training and is the recipient of a research grant from the American Orf Association. Articles that Dr. Ardasani has written or co-authored have appeared in the Journal for Music Teacher Education, the Orf Echo, and General Music Today. Dr. Ardasani is also the organist pianist at the Church of Universal Fellowship in Orono. She has taught at the Lincoln School in Providence, Rhode Island, North Orrington, and Center Drive Schools in Orrington, Maine, and the Stillwater Montessori School in Stillwater, Maine. We also have with us today Dr. Zachary Rockwell Ludington. Zachary Rockwell Ludington is assistant professor of Spanish at the University of Maine, where he also serves as a faculty affiliate for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Previously, he has taught at Emory University and the University Denise Sophia Antipoulos, now University Côte d'Azur, and the University of Virginia, where he earned his PhD in 2014. His research centers on the poetry of the historical avant-garde in Spain. His essays appear or are forthcoming in Hispanophilia, the Revista Canadiense de Estudios Hispanicos, Dada Surrealism, and the Revista de Estudios Hispanicos, the International Yearbook of Futurism Studies, and other journals. He's currently at work on a book project to analyze a pastoral strain in Iberian avant-garde poetry in several languages. An active literary translator, his English version of Agustin Fernandez Mallo's Pixel Flesh was published by Cardboard House Press in 2020. And finally, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Amelia Couturbu. I'm an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Maine. I received my PhD in communication studies from the University of Michigan, and my research uses a range of quantitative methods, including experimental design, scale development, and psychophysiology, i.e. eye tracking and galvanic skin response, to examine the effect that media exposure has on audience. My other research interests include the impact of social media on body image and topics related to media and empowerment. And most recently, I've been examining strategies to develop college admissions recruitment materials that more effectively empower women to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and math, also known as STEM. So to begin, I would like to ask everyone to just tell us a little bit about what it is that you teach and the research that you do here at Maine. So I'm just going to go in order of what I have on my Zoom screen. So let's start with Dr. Zach Ludington.
Thanks. Yeah, I teach all kinds of classes in Spanish. I was hired as the specialist in peninsular literature, and that's peninsular, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. So my counterpart, Carlos Villacorta, is our specialist in Latin American literature. I teach courses on literature and feminism. I teach the history of the Spanish language. I teach a course on my focused research area, the modernist period, avant-garde poetry, the beginning of the 20th century. I teach some intermediate language courses. I teach the gamut, basically. And my research, as you said, my research is in the historical avant-garde, and that means that I write essays in specialized journals, like you mentioned, some of these on the poetry of that period. I think a lot of people, students and faculty, don't really know what research in the humanities looks like. So I brought out some of this stuff to actually show that there's a physical, or in many cases, a digital result of critical engagement with the scholarship and the literary texts that are of our interest. The research that I publish, for example, the article that I have in this journal, is literary criticism. It's work that rethinks, reorders, or reinterprets literary works, or the networks and models that we have and that we continue to change and develop to understand literary history and the way we read. I'm also a translator, as you said, so some of my research is in translation. I've translated a little bit of scholarship, for example, an article chapter in the Cambridge University Press, History of Theater in Spain. I translated an essay by another scholar, but I also translate poetry. So for example, this book is a book of poems recently published, or this book, also a book of poetry, oops, the other way, that I published a couple of years ago, and also in literary journals, poems here and there. That's what my research looks like, and it also includes sometimes contributing to the research enterprise by reviewing books by other scholars. So those are books that, like my essays, analyze literary works, analyze literary periods, reshape the canon, reshape the way we understand terminology like romanticism or avant-garde, postmodern, baroque. Those terms need to be consistently rethought and reimagined and reconfigured. And that's pretty much what the enterprise of literary criticism is.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for that. And I know students don't always know how to get involved in this type of research, which is part of, why we're all here as panelists today. So that'll be another question, but thank you for giving us an introduction. Dr. Stefano Tiharina, do you want to share a little bit about your teaching and research?
Yes, thank you, Amelia. So what do I teach? I teach courses in international business, both for the early entry student and then the more advanced student. I also teach comparative business, which is comparing the different styles and the different cultures and the different dynamics of different countries and their business realities. And I am focused on Canada and the United States particularly. I teach a class called Canada-US Business Relations, which is also cross-listed with economics. I also teach courses on business ethics, and for the MBA program, I teach courses on organizational culture, contemporary organizational cultures, which means that involves ethics and all the different social and cultural issues that force change both in government and in businesses internally, particularly in contemporary businesses today. My research is focused particularly on the historic strategy of American and Canadian businesses entering Latin America. So I focused on the trajectory of an idea from a company all the way to this execution, extracting resources in another country, or impacting policy in another country in order to advance their own business interests in foreign markets, but from a historical perspective. And I also write I write books. Well, I don't write books. I've already written one book, but I'm working on another one, so I won't do the plural. I add my own content to book chapters, which is very normal with historians, business historians. I write for a blog on the history of narcotics and pharmaceuticals, and that's a subtopic that I'm interested in as a business historian, and the trajectory of the whole narcotics and pharma world, which is something that is extremely interesting to me. And I also write for economic policy journals, particularly government documents related to Canadian Maine relations or Canadian New England relations. And that is a new avenue that I have pursued as a result of the pandemic and as a result of being invited by other scholars to contribute to my own regional perspective on that topic. And I also review books from other historians and do the typical stuff that other scholars do. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. Dr. Laura Ardasani.
Hello, everyone. As was mentioned, my graduate degrees are in piano performance, so my research usually is an intersection of some research and performance. So an example of a recent project is our trombone professor, Dr. Dan Barrett, and I collaborated on a project about the Brazilian composer Egberto Gismonti, and transcribed some of his works for trombone and piano, and found out more about his compositional style and his background, and we performed some of his pieces at a national conference in Arlington, Virginia, and then also here on campus, and hope to perform it at other places as well once the pandemic lets up a little bit. So that's one example. I teach music education courses, so I work with students who are planning to be music educators, and my area is general music classes. And I've done some research on Gunal Kateman and Doreen Hall, who helped bring the Orf Approach. In my bio, it mentions Orf, and that's an approach to music education. And those two women helped bring the Orf Schulwerk approach to Canada and United States. So I've spent some time in Ottawa looking at some archives there and correspondence between those two women. So that's another interest of mine. And before I became chair, I also taught some music history courses, and I was interested in intersecting the Orf approach with music history. So I had my students more actively involved, playing instruments, doing medieval dances, and those kind of things as part of the class. So those are some of my research interests.
Perfect, thank you so much. And I was actually going to have you explain a little bit about the Orf approach, and would you mind just sharing a little bit more context there for people who are unfamiliar?
Sure. It was founded by Carl Orff right before World War II. And the basic premise is that a child learns to talk by talking. We don't sit a child down and say, okay, before you talk, you have to learn how to spell and learn how to put a sentence together and learn grammar. a child just learns by doing it. So that it should be the same way with music, that the first thing is that a child experiences music and helps create music. And we have Orf instruments, which are like xylophones, and we can take certain bars off so that whatever they play is going to make a pleasant sound. They can experiment with that. And then the music literacy part comes later. So that's it in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I guess just a little bit of context about myself. So I teach within the Media Studies department here in the Department of Communication, Media, and Journalism. I typically teach courses related to media psychology or things like Intro to Media Studies. So really interested there in, how do we interact with media? How are the media structured? Questions about how media use affects our day-to-day life. And my research really mirrors that as well. So I tend to take a social sciences approach. So I use things like surveys and experiments and work with participants, and also do things like content analyses where I'll look at media messages and figure out what exactly is contained within that message. And these are all areas that, research assistants could potentially help. So I guess just kind of on that note, I'd love to hear from all of you how you have RAs or research assistants that are undergraduate students get involved in either Center for Undergraduate Research, so CUGR projects, or I guess just projects more broadly. And I guess we'll just go in the same order. So we'll start with Dr. Zach Ludington.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a tough question, actually, because the majority of my research is pretty solitary work. I read, I think, I write, and I engage with other scholars in my area. That, however, doesn't mean that undergrads can't participate or that I can't guide an undergrad. I think when I was an undergrad, I had a really unusual, but still kind of imaginable experience for an undergrad, perhaps with me or with another professor in the humanities. I was a research assistant supported by a grant that a professor of mine had, and I had to just scroll through a bunch of old documents looking for stuff. I was looking at all kinds of ship manifests and things like that from the 16th century, trying to find mentions of particular things that my professor was interested in. And I wasn't writing anything. I was helping her sort through piles and piles of material, but it was helpful for me as a future scholar in the humanities to learn what it looked like to collect documentation, to sift through old materials and to try to piece things together. But as a CUGR faculty fellow this last year, I had a CUGR student researcher working under me. And so with a lot of faculty, let's say in biology, right? Maybe a CUGR student that's supported with a grant from CUGR that works with them is working in their lab on the faculty members project. But in the humanities, we don't really have expenses, hardly, maybe a few books here and there. And so maybe it's easier and it makes more sense for the faculty member to support the student's work. And that means that with the CUGR grant, I was able to guide this student through a project of her own interest. It wasn't really in my area, but the work that I do is similar in that it depends on crafting an argument, responsibly citing scholarship, building a case for something, and articulating a vision of a particular problem or topic in the world that has to be robustly backed up, with current knowledge. I think we did a pretty good job of that. She actually spun off from that project the essay that went on to win the Honors College's Resendez Ethics Essay Prize last year, which came with a $3,200 top prize. So it was a really, really positive experience for her, I think. Just whatever she feels about it, it was really financially beneficial. And she was able to use the CUGR support as a stipend. Plus, she won the essay award, and I think she did good work towards what may be in the future a career in, she's not quite sure, but in law, federal law enforcement is something she's interested in, or public administration. is a good exercise for him. So that's what I see from my experience so far. But I also imagine, many of the things that they work on, like this is a literary magazine I published some translations in, and when you look at Masthead, almost all his names are students. This is at the College of the Atlantic, just down in Bar Harbor. So there are plenty of opportunities at UMaine and elsewhere in the humanities generally for students to participate in preparing publications, translating or performing humanities scholarship are really cheap endeavors as far as materials. So if a student is interested and able to find faculty support, it's just a question of guidance more than anything else. Right now, I've been invited to contribute an essay to the next number of Paideuma, which is a literary journal in the English department at UMaine. And most of the people that actually do the work of putting that journal together and organizing the essays are students.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And congratulations to both you and your student on what sounds like an extremely successful project.
Thanks. I believed in her, but there's competition for it. And so when she won the top prize, it was like, whoa, $3,200. Wow.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of change there. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm sure just the acknowledgement for her work was very gratifying too. And I think, at least in my experience, I found that students often read journal articles in some of their classes, and it can be really intimidating because they're not necessarily seeing student publications. So I think your point about students publishing in student-led publications where, there's research scholarship that exclusively publishes from undergraduate student projects, it's a more guided process than going through the full peer review that faculty necessarily engage in. And that's not to say that students can't publish in those papers too. So I know I'm currently working with a student and we plan to submit to Media Psychology, which is a top tier journal in our field. But there are options in many different avenues. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Dr. Tiharina, would you like to share a little bit?
Yeah, so I have not had a chance to work with the research assistants here in the Maine Business School, but I do work with students that come up from my classes, and then I guide them into the CUGR opportunities, and then help them define a question or define a topic based on material that has been discussed in our classroom, and that they perhaps find a further interest in come and visit me in office hours, and then I tell them that I will guide them through the research process. So I've been very successful in guiding 3-4 students every semester through their business research program, research initiatives through CUGR. And then I work with honor students on a consistent basis. And of course, I work with their own research endeavors in marketing and management. They do a lot of data analysis and collection and analysis. They do market research. They do more management research, for example, HR questions, labor questions, and things of this sort. Last summer, I had a student that did research on comparing states to nations in terms of their economic development standards to find out if there are third world dynamics inside developed nations. And that surfaced from a little research that I have going, and I invited the student to do some of the research with me, and that became another opportunity for me to think of future ways to engage students in my own research down the road.
Wonderful. And in terms of students gaining experience for things like data analysis, do you find that you typically, are students getting this in your courses? Are you doing this hands-on in individual meetings and mentorship? I guess for a student who doesn't have that experience, how would they get started?
So some of the students that are interested in data analysis are coming out of the marketing department, which is where they're doing a lot of this work. And then because of my presence here at the Maine Business School, then together with my marketing colleagues, we are able to sort of direct the student into material they already know, as software usage and other things of that sort. So they do work with data here heavily, because that's part as part of marketing. Yeah.
Okay,
And that
perfect.
data analytics, of course.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And Dr. Laura Ardasani, I know you had some PowerPoints to share, so the next question will be about specific undergraduate projects. I don't know at what point would be most appropriate for the information that you were hoping to share. If you want to talk about a little bit generally about how they would get involved, or if you want to dive into
Sure.
specifics.
I'll just talk for a moment, and then Mindy, if you wouldn't mind getting the slides up, that would be great. So I will say that I think if any undergraduate student at the university wants to get involved in research, they can find a way to do it. I think across the board, the faculty is very supportive. In my experience, most of the students have been involved in research through a CUGR fellowship or through their honors thesis, or for our BA degree in music, the capstone is a research project or a lecture recital, again with that intersection of research and performing music. And we also have had some students who just wanted to do an independent study, and we made that happen. We've had a couple of externships as opposed to internships, and these externships are typically sophomores or juniors who want to go out into schools and do some sort of project. So it's been a variety of things, but if you are participating in this webinar and you want to do some research, I just say go for it. You'll find some help and support. So Mindy, if you want to share the slides, I'll go through those quickly. I just wanted to share some examples of some things that students in music have done. So these are two students who were part of the UMaine Steiners, which is a cappella group, and they were being asked to go into schools quite frequently and not only do concerts, but to do workshops with the students. And so they wanted to try to organize these workshops a little better. So we did a project where they interviewed the music teachers at the schools where they were going ahead of time. What things do you want us to cover? We kind of aligned those with the national standards in music education, and then they interviewed the music educators afterwards to find out how effective they were. So that was one project that we did. Next slide, please. This student was working on two fundraisers. One was a fundraiser for the School of Performing Arts, which we had in the Collins Center. And then he was also working on a fundraiser for a trip that the university singers took in 2016 to Ireland and Dublin. So he identified a marketing strategy for each of those fundraisers. And he actually won Best Exhibit at the Student Symposium. So I was proud of him for his work with that. So the next couple of slides are just from the trip that we took. So this is us arriving at Dublin Airport as a result. And we would have gone on this trip regardless of his fundraising efforts, but because of his fundraising efforts, it cost less for each student. We were able to take the money that he raised through various places and bring the cost down for each student. Next slide. This is just a group of students. This is us in Ireland. And next slide. This is a poster from one of our concerts in England, and we had a free day in London. So that was a really fun trip, and he was able to make it more realistic for people to go because of the cost going down. Next slide. Oh, that's us in Ely Cathedral outside of London. Next slide. So Drew Brooks was, as you can see, the UMaine valedictorian, and he had a double major in music and microbiology. So for his BA project, he did a lecture recital on 19th century songs by Schubert, Schumann, and Hugo Wolf. So he compared and contrasted those composers and did a performance on that. So that was his research project. Next slide. Kimberly Hunt was just given a fellowship, and she's a piano major, and she's very interested in Rachmaninoff. So she's going to travel to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. to look at some of his correspondence. So she's very excited about that. Next slide. And this is my last example. Jamie Roy did an honors thesis. She played in the pep band. She was very concerned about the noise level. And she did a very clear and interesting study about when the pep band plays at Alfond Arena and when the pep band plays at the Cross Center, The noise level was worse at the Alphon Arena because they were up by the ceiling and the way the sound waves were bouncing off. So she measured before and after she had, she tried out different kinds of earplugs. She encouraged people in the band to wear different kinds of earplugs, and now she is a graduate student in audiology. So that's just 5 quick examples. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So I think here we have a lot of different examples of the type of work that students could do, whether it's joining a faculty's existing project or creating a new project of their own design, doing archival research for a faculty member. I know in my field and in social sciences, I often need people to run participants through labs. So setting people up at eye trackers or working with them and getting them set up in lab environments. So I do think that's worth noting that all of us are very enthusiastic to work with students, and it sounds like all of us share this joy. And when a student comes to us with a project, I know, at least for me, I'm really excited to make it work with them. So I would encourage students who are interested, don't be afraid to meet with someone. You can get information about how to write a nice formal email letter expressing your interest, and then don't be afraid to come in and develop ideas with a faculty member. There are often a bunch of different ways that you can get involved, which kind of leads into my next question. And Laura, your example was a perfect transition into specific projects. So I'd love to hear a little more detail about specific projects, maybe a single undergraduate student that you were extremely proud of their work, and how it impacted the student's experience at UMaine and then also future careers. So similar to Dr. Ardasani's example with the student who did the project and then went on to audiology, love to hear a follow-up as well. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Ludington.
Thanks. I've only worked with as an undergraduate researcher, other than honors thesis and capstone, my CUGR student, and she is interested and has been for a long time in perhaps working for the FBI or the Justice Department. That's kind of what she imagines for her future. And one of the things that she wanted to explore was, as a Spanish major also, how our legal system deals with linguistic difference. We have a couple of laws in different states that prohibit linguistic discrimination explicitly in certain contexts. And then we have prohibitions against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, national origin, etc., at the national level, at the federal level. And those prohibitions don't really directly address linguistic discrimination, but sometimes linguistic discrimination can be understood as a kind of ethnic discrimination, for example, or national origin discrimination. And so that was her project, was as a Spanish major, thinking through language, thinking through the language as a global phenomenon, as a cultural marker, stuff like that, and also the language of law as a person who's interested in law, thinking of the nuances in law and how law can be interpreted to discover kind of how linguistic discrimination works in the US. Because the United States is party to treaties that prohibit explicitly discrimination on the basis of language in all contexts. So while we don't have federal law that prohibits it, we do have international treaties to which we're party that do. So she found some instances in which federal law probably could be understood to prohibit the kind of linguistic discrimination that certain plaintiffs experienced. And certainly, she argued, the international human rights treaties to which we're party would prohibit that kind of discrimination. And she argues that it is the responsibility of the federal government to then prosecute those moments of discrimination so that we can uphold the treaties that were signed and that we're bound to. So it was a really a project that united her various interests, and she started it as someone who wants to work in law or in some kind of governmental capacity, and also someone who's interested in language as a Spanish major. the immediate success, I think, was really surprising because she's also in the Honors College, and someone said, hey, you know, there's this annual ethics essay prize. Maybe you'd like to submit something to it. And we retooled some of her work to be more explicitly invested in ethics. And she asked, is it okay if I have a faculty member help me prepare this essay? And they said yes. Is it okay if this essay grows out of something that I'm working on for a CUGR project? And they said yes. So we then kind of made the CUGR project mostly about that, and it won the prize. We'll see what happens in her future, but she's looking at potentially teaching in Spain next year after she graduates, teaching English. And then she is looking at maybe applying to Masters in Public Administration programs or pursuing work immediately with an organization like the Justice Department or the FBI. So I think that even though I'm a literary scholar and she's a Spanish major, and sometimes students think, well, that doesn't have any immediate application. There's no way to take those kind of skills and turn them into, or take the research in that kind of area and turn it into the kind of work I see myself doing, like working for the Justice Department. That's not necessarily the case. And I think, as you said a moment ago, and as Dr. Ardasani said, faculty members, I think generally are excited to try to find those connections and help students build a project so that those kind of disparate interests, or what seem disparate to a student, can be united and turned into something that maybe propels them in their career in a way that they didn't imagine. Audiology is a really good example. You know, a music major, they can focus some of the thinking that they have about how sound works and what musicians do, and that helps them to articulate a path for them in their future career. My wife's a speech language pathologist, which is an allied area, and so I'm familiar with that, familiar-ish with that kind of area. It's interesting.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And just as one more question, I guess, what did her day-to-day experience doing research look like? So I know a lot of people think of research and they think of labs and they think of STEM fields and pipetting and working with Petri dishes and samples. You know, what did her day-to-day look like? What types of tasks was she focused on?
Yeah, I mean, you know, research in the physical sciences is different from research in the humanities, to be sure, but the goal is creating new knowledge. And so just as a chemist works with the knowledge that we currently have about how certain polymers work, right, and how they can be formed, or what the limitations in the lab or in the manufacturing process are for creating a polymer, I don't know, right, for example. A humanist looks at the knowledge that we have about what discrimination means legally in these contexts, and then what the reality is on the ground for certain people, and tries to articulate an argument, which ultimately amounts to a new piece, a new kind of knowledge for understanding something X, this moment, you know, in someone's life that they consider, and that those who their advocates consider discrimination, how to articulate that in terms of why, a body of a law of laws that already exists. You make an argument this kind of in the same way that a physical scientist might. You know, this is possible because I found this backing for it, and then you see if that's actually the case. The scientific method is not the same as making a humanistic argument, but in both cases, you take what's available to you and you try to articulate new knowledge out of it. So she looked at these case studies, news items, right? 2 women, for example, that were detained in Montana, some 150 miles from the Canadian border. So outside of that 100-mile band that Border Patrol has wider jurisdiction. They were detained because a Border Patrol agent in the convenience shop that they were also in heard them speaking Spanish and stopped them, questioned them, held them, took the driver's licenses, you know, basically, what are you doing here and why are you here, for a couple of hours, right? They were both US citizens, they were both born in the United States, and they were simply in line at the convenience store, you know, buying donuts or whatever and speaking Spanish. That's very clearly illegal, I think, to me, right? It's an illegal detention. There's no evidence for any detention. It's a Border Patrol agent. He doesn't have any broadened jurisdiction beyond that 100-mile band. There are different rules for within 100 miles of a land border. So that's different, but it wasn't within that band. And so she articulated the legal basis for why that should be considered discrimination on the basis of ethnicity in the United States in federal law and also in international treaty law. And that was basically her work, to find those instances and then read legal theory and read cases, and from those make a case for what linguistic discrimination was.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Stefano Tiharina, would you like to hop in and share maybe a more specific example? I know you mentioned a bunch of different types of research people could do. What would you be interested in sharing?
Well, okay, so I'll go from more present to a little bit to the past, but right now I have a student that is in my international business class. He got very interested in China's presence in the United States as companies and as investment, as foreign investment. And so he's interested in looking at what is the presence of Chinese capital in the United States. And that is going to be his research, collecting data on what subsidiaries are Chinese, what direct companies are Chinese, what conglomerates own what type of businesses in the United States, or segment markets like communications or Hollywood or things of this sort, paper companies like here in Old Town, Maine, where the ND paper owns, it's a Chinese company that owns the paper production here in Maine. And that's the one that got him curious. And then from then on, he took it into a more macro analysis. But I've also had students that are, for example, I have very interesting stories. I had a student that did a business plan for her own design of her lobster fishing business, because she is a fisher and paid most of her college by catching lobster during the summer. So then she built a business plan, and that was her research project, and that was the plan that she is now executing as an alumni of UMaine, beginning to build her own business in the coast of Maine, developing from this research project that was her initiative. I've also had students analyze customer responses in social media, particular products like Peloton, and the reaction of the public regarding the brand or the use or the quality of the product or things of this sort. And of course, the one that I mentioned, the third world inside the first world, which also is a question of business and quality of life, and the impact of capitalism and policy inside the United States, but looking at from the global to the local. So those are the type of experience that I can remember off the top of my head. The last one is an honors thesis on Flint, Michigan's privatization of water. And that, of course, was a business-related topic, although it had a more social justice and human rights component. But of course, business can be looked at from that angle as well. As a criticism to privatization and business practices of the contemporary times, which was also an intellectual endeavor from the point of view of my student.
Thank you so much for that. And I guess just a little bit more about what students produce. Do you find that students typically produce a research manuscript? Do they produce a presentation? How do they share this research that they've done with other people? So
they have been presenting their work at CUGR consistently at the Symposium, and that's of course the most attractive venue for them to show their work to other colleagues and to the community. I hope that the third world in the first world will become an article in a journal, an academic journal, but that is still in the works. But that would be another venue to show. And then, of course, the business plan, it was a very personal and individualistic project, and it was the students' own project and ownership, and therefore it was not shared necessarily. It became a capstone for her business degree, and because she was not an honor student and was not a CUGR candidate as well, it was more of an internal thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Dr. Ardasani, you've already shared some really wonderful specific examples. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or things in terms of other trajectories or things that you think would be helpful for the people listening to the call to hear?
Well, I'll just follow up the student who did the fundraisers. He was very interested in arts management and arts marketing, and he was working at the Boston Opera House in their office, but he just got a job as manager of the Colonial Theater in Boston. So he'll be doing a lot of fundraising now. So I think his experiences through the CUGR Fellowship were very helpful to him. And Drew Brooks, who was the valedictorian and had a double major in music and microbiology, is now in med school. So just a little follow-up there.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know students often don't know exactly what they're interested in doing after they graduate. So for example, I'm working with a student right now on a project that was initially my conception, but she really took it over and made it her own. We're looking at basically Zoom fatigue and body image, and looking at how camera settings, so things like having your camera off or on, can impact learning and cognition, and how much attention you have to devote to other tasks like a math test. And I know eventually she's interested in maybe pursuing grad school, but I've been encouraging her that these research experiences are things that other fields like to see as well. So even, if she decides to do something applied with marketing, it's really great to have this experience on your resume. We have a few minutes left, so quite a bit of time. I'd love to hear from anyone in the audience who has questions, maybe questions for the panelists. And if you have a question, you're welcome to put that in the chat, or I'm not sure, I believe that you should be able to also potentially ask with audio, but I know that you should have access with the chat. And I guess just while people are thinking too, I know for some of the students that I've spoken with, one of the hardest things is figuring out how to get started with a project. And I know a lot of the students that I've worked with, we started thinking about projects in classes. So an idea would come up in relation to something we were discussing. And then, we'd talk about, this would be a great area for future research, and then start formulating a plan on how to pursue that more. I've also had students that I had existing projects, and students just came to me and said, hey, I'm interested in research. Do you have anything ongoing? And I was able to direct them to a specific project. What have you found that, I guess just an open question for all the panelists, what have you found is most successful? What do you hope that students come to you with?
It's always helpful if students come with something that they're already interested in and trying to find funding for that, rather than, oh, there's funding, what idea could I come up with, which is the way it happens sometimes, but it's always best if it's something that they're already interested in, whether within a class or maybe even outside of a class, and to find out, how can we make your idea fit? How can we get support for you?
So it sounds like curiosity is a big part there. So being excited about a specific idea,
yes,
or a topic more broadly. And I think I saw, yeah, Dr. Zach Ludington, did you want to hop in?
Well, I was going to say this didn't come to fruition, but I hope that something like what I imagine in this case could. I have a student who's a really strong student. She's graduating now in this fall. And she sent me a month ago, maybe, a link to some poems that she had published in a journal for undergraduate poets. And she's been taking my courses for a couple of years, and she's been interested in poetry, and that's what we talk about in class, and that's what we analyze in class. And I was really happy to see that. If she weren't going away, I might say, she's also in translation with me right now. If she weren't going away and graduating and going on to do other things right now, I might say, hey, if you want to stay, if you're interested in translation and you want to translate something, I would love to guide you through that, and we can try to see if we can place those poems in some of the journals that I'm familiar with, and I can, help you with the translation work. That's something that if a student is interested in poetry and wants to pursue that, it's pretty easy, materially. It's just a matter of time, getting together and thinking through it, guidance. So hopefully that kind of thing. And with a CUGR grant, there are all kinds of things that I hope to that I've kind of imagined doing. At UMaine Machias, there's a book arts program, and I've imagined one day getting in contact with the guy that runs that program down there and finding some students who are interested in letterpress and trying to do poems and actually get our hands dirty with the materiality of poetry and producing something. It's like I said with this magazine at College of the Atlantic, students are intimately involved in the layout and in the actual physical production of this literary journal. It's really cool. So hopefully there's space and interest for those kind of projects. But as Dr. Ardasani said, it's if a student has a passion and comes to you, you can shape it. And the CUGR money for those grants hopefully can actually make those passions, turn into something tangible at the end.
And I guess related to a point that you mentioned, you had the student who approached you who is a senior and they're graduating. I would really encourage students also to think about how to get involved in research early on. So one of the students that I'm working with she completed a summer CUGR project. So she received a fellowship to do that work with Zoom and body image and learning environments. And she joined I have a lab. It's not the same as, a natural sciences lab, but we meet and we talk about research and we talk about ideas. And she joined early on in her junior year. And we've had a couple of years together where she's been able to really grow in her research capacity. And, she's learned a lot of different skills because she's been working through this for a while. So I would also encourage students that, it's never too early. And often, it's not too late either. We can work with students at various stages. So I guess just a word of encouragement for anyone who is waiting to have the perfect project. You don't necessarily have to have everything together. You just need to take that first step. Anything else that any of our panelists would like to add or that you think would be useful information for attendees to hear?
Well, I would just repeat what I mentioned to my students, that not only in the business field, but in every field, professional field, if you have a research skill, if you have a research interest, if you are interested in the word research and you're not intimidated by it, you will be able to navigate your organizational culture, no matter where you are in a job, in a career, in a very different manner, because you will become an asset to the organization that you work for, simply because those skills are extremely valuable, and everybody in every field, no matter what it is looking for people that are curious about questioning and digging deeper and understanding things and coming up with new ideas and new solutions. And this seems to be the phrase of the 21st century: change, adaptability, new solutions, new ideas, new ways of constructing the world.
Yeah, that's really wonderful advice and very inspiring too. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add?
I would just add to, I hope anybody that sees this, students, and I think all students generally, to look around and realize kind of what the university is. Most students, I think, come to the University of Maine thinking that, okay, what I need to do is take these courses in this order and do this to and fulfill this program of study for a degree. And of course, that's important. That's how we actually map out what a degree is. But while they're here, they have the opportunity to also take advantage of the fact that this is a research university where knowledge is created and art is created and exchanged and analyzed. So outside of what each 3 credit or 4 credit, whatever course does, students, if they ask, if they pursue and dig a little bit, they can discover that there's a lot of activity on campus, and I think there's enthusiasm to help them participate.
It's wonderful. I see we have a question from a panelist. So Dr. Tiharina put a great question. So did the panel become involved in research during their undergraduate experience? I'm happy to start with this. I did. I worked with a faculty mentor I went to Vassar College, so it was a small liberal arts school, but I was taking a seminar in social psychology and was really excited about methods and kept coming up with these, what would happen if we did this, or what would happen if we examined that? And so I had a faculty member who took me under her wing, and we worked on a couple research projects together. I was not creating my own design, but I was working on existing projects, and really did pave the way for me to continue on in grad school. And she was a letter writer for me, and an inspiration, and also is the one who told me that she thought I should apply to PhD programs, which is how I ended up where I am today. And I know probably other people have similar or different stories.
The research I did at the undergraduate level, maybe not the traditional type of research, but I was in a small music group that did a lot of traveling and promoted the college, and we received scholarships in return for doing this. And we were expected as part of that group to create arrangements for the group, music arrangements. So I did those as part of that experience. And because I was told that I should, so I did it and found out that I could do it. And also we had a composer coming in electronic music, and our professor wanted us to create a piece for electronic music before the composer came. And again, it's not something I thought I could do, but I was told that I should. So I did it, and the piece was performed when the composer came. So those were 2 examples I can think of where I was encouraged, maybe not confident at first, but found that I indeed could give it a try and come up with a product.
And sometimes that push can be really helpful. It's funny to say now, but I remember within my psych degree, we had to take a research methods course. And at that time, I really thought I wanted to do clinical psychology. I was convinced that that was my path. And I was honestly a little bit resistant to having to take those research methods courses. And then as I started reading journal articles later, I discovered that that was actually my passion. So those distribution requirements or those formal encouragements can really help us explore things that stretch our boundaries. What about other panelists?
Did you do research as an undergraduate?
Having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
I was saying, Stefano, did you do research as an undergraduate?
No, I asked the question because I did not experience research as an undergraduate, and then when I landed my first job was as a economic newspaper translator, and only economic and management language from Spanish to English. And I found out that I really needed to do research in order to execute that job. And that's the first time I realized that I lacked the research experience, and that perhaps research was going to be the way. And then when I landed my first banking job, to become a salesperson and to build a database of clients and to do this type of work actually was research. And then it was once again confirmed that I needed to be a researcher if I wanted to succeed in a banking world, which I never thought that was the case. And then I got interested in research. And then that's why in my 30s, I became a scholar and pursued a PhD, because I became very interested in something that I didn't know that was connected to my banking career and early on in my life. So that's why I was curious. So I wish I would have known this, 10 years before. That way I could have skipped my whole 20s before figuring out that I was going to pursue research the rest of my life.
But I'm sure those experiences that you had in your 20s pre-research really shaped the way that you do research, and
yes.
Those experiences are formative too. So I think everyone has their own path in terms
Yes.
of how they get there, and both paths work.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And I know, Zach, you mentioned, I believe you mentioned some experience you had as an undergraduate research experience.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure. I was coming into my junior year of college and wasn't sure what I was going to do. And yeah, and I thought, well, I'm interested in literature, and I'm a Spanish major, and they're my professors, and what they do is read and write and lecture on literature, and maybe that's something I can do. So I approached one of my professors and asked her what that looked like, what the career looked like. And I said, is there a way to gain research experience and see if that's something that I would be interested in? And she said, it just so happens, and this was pretty rare because there aren't a whole lot of grants in the humanities, but she said, it just so happens that I recently won a grant from the government of Taiwan, because she was working on more kind of historical cultural studies than literary studies. She was working on the Spanish imperial presence in East Asia. And so there was a grant from the government of Taiwan for researchers in history and cultural history that she won to write a book on the Spanish Empire in East Asia. And what she asked me to do was to dig through documents from the late 16th century and early 17th century in the digital archives of the Spanish National Library. And I was looking for instances of mentioned in letters back and forth between Spanish colonial administrators and the court in Spain, instances of violence against Chinese tradespeople, especially violence that came about because of misunderstandings about rules and protocols and particularly religious customs. So it was a weird thing, right? I had to look through all these documents, which were written in a 16th or 17th century hand, and they were quite difficult to read in many cases, and they were scanned and available digitally. And I had to, learn to kind of parse the format and discover how are these letters usually formatted, to whom are they addressed, what is this, how does this discourse structure itself, looking for patterns and trying to find she was hoping to understand, and thus I was trying to understand in order to provide her documents to look at. Why do the Spanish colonial administrators exercise violence against these Chinese tradespeople? And it was almost always instances of misunderstandings and kind of like, we have these rules that as colonial administrators and administrators of the port, we have to exercise these rules, and the punishment for X is this violent punishment. And so we exercise this punishment against these Chinese traders that came, but they didn't seem to understand why, and we didn't feel that maybe it made sense. So we're asking whether we should continue to do that in the future. Should we execute these guys as we've been doing? It doesn't seem kind of right. But of course, correspondence took so long that even when there were questions among those who were carrying out these brutal punishments and said maybe that's not what we should do, they kept on doing it for many months before they got a response that said, no, that's bad for business, stop doing it. Really kind of a strange intersection of economic and colonial policy and culture, and so I learned to ask those questions by doing that work, and I learned to organize myself to deal with a lot of documents and to know begin to learn how to sift and know when to kind of read deeper, when to scan, and how to organize what I've been finding and keep track of my notes.
And I think organization is something that we all learn, and it can be an ongoing process as we continue research. So we are just a couple minutes over, so I want to be respectful of all of your time, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I enjoyed hearing more about your experiences and the experiences of your students. And I would encourage students who are listening who have questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.